we talk a lot about trust with this software. Like, how is it that we can verify the trust that we have in software, right? Because a lot of it we can't see behind the curtain.
Right. And that's another conceptual distinction I'd like to make is between open source and closed source software. Closed source software is Microsoft Windows, Mac OS, iOS, QuickBooks. I mean, pretty much any paid for application, Photoshop, anything like that, where there's a copyright on it and it's a proprietary piece of software that in order to take a look and see what's inside of iOS, you have to work for Apple. Like, there's just no way around it. It's secret, right? Open source software is different. Open source software is published and available. The source code is published. So it's possible to go into the source code and actually see what it does. And that adds a lot of transparency. It's not a perfect solution. There's a fair number of corporations that open source software after the fact. Probably the best example is Doom, because I don't know if you guys have seen videos of like Doom running on a printer or something.
Yeah.
John
Doom,
Carmack.
the video game?
The video game, yeah, the 1993 video game. Yeah.
Running on a printer?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a meme. It's like all kinds of crazy stuff that Doom runs on. And it was open source like back in the late 90s. And it's awesome because it made all its money, and then they were like, all right, here we go, community, do what you will with it.
Right.
Fun.
So, and not many people have the skill to look at source code and analyze it, right? But there are people out there that they get great pleasure from doing that. So for me personally, it adds a lot of trust when a developer or an organization says, here's our source code. It's out in public. It's just, how do you hide something? You can't hide anything in there for long. You can't hide backdoors in there for long if that's the case.
Because there's a community of people who, like you said, get pleasure and fulfillment out of exploring this code, have the technical prowess to understand what they're looking at, and would, let people know, hey, look, don't use this software. It's compromised, or they're sneaking in this thing or that thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're aware of it, and they're going to communicate it to the public.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on top of that, it also leads to like interesting projects that come out of something that's open sourced. I mean, it depends on, it can get pretty technical with the license specifically that something is open sourced under. But for the most part, if you open source something, the community can take it and build something off of it. And probably the biggest example of this is with Android. Because Android was developed by Google, and it powers all of, basically it's seen as a Google product. But Android is open source. The core of Android is open source. You can go on GitHub and look up the Android open source project and see Android. Now, it's not the same as the Android that comes on a Samsung phone, for example, because Samsung has taken that open source core Samsung has taken an open source core of Android and built Samsung Android. And then that becomes a proprietary thing. And again, the licensing gets complicated, but the cool thing is that there's some in the community that have taken the core of Android and developed a security-focused, privacy-focused version of Android that you can trust and you can put on your phone, and it buys you a lot. The project I'm thinking of is called Graphene OS, and it's awesome because it runs Android apps. You can install it on a Pixel phone, so you get the benefit of a well-engineered, up-to-date phone. A lot of the privacy phones before then were severely compromised. So because the core of Android is open source, and you have to be careful as which version of Android you use, because in general, Android is not private at all. But still, projects like that exist. And it's the same with Google Chrome. Like, Google Chrome is seen as a Google product, and it is, but the core of Chrome is open source. So the guys at Brave took Google Chrome and built Brave, which is a privacy-focused browser, which is awesome.
And indistinguishable from Chrome. Like you use it, you don't ever get the feeling that you're using some low-grade version of Chrome. Like, you get a very familiar experience. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the other benefits too is, like, especially with Android, security issues come up and they need to be patched quickly. That stuff is patched in the open source version of Android first, and it kind of trickles down from there. So if you're running a Graphene OS phone, you benefit from all that work and all that investment And you still have a secure product that's just focused on security.
So we
and
don't
privacy.
So obviously all of our Android guides are like, okay, yeah. What about iPhone and Apple? Because that's always the division.
Yep.
Right.
I was going to ask. I'm a full Mac ecosystem guy. Are you just saying throw me to the wolves? I'm done for?
Yeah.
Because I mean, Apple's been very public about how privacy focused they are, but obviously, like you mentioned before, it's a closed ecosystem, so we can't know.
You can't know
how good or bad is Apple in your view.
So I was also completely in the Apple ecosystem. I had an iPhone, I had an iPad, a Mac, the whole nine. They're great for development as a developer. They're amazing development machines. They're really high quality products and they keep their value really well. So there's a lot going for them. My issue with Apple comes from, well, like for an example, just this December, there was a story that there was a government program where Apple and Google both, the Google part didn't surprise me, but the Apple part did, that they were spying on push notifications. Push notifications have to go through, this is the way they work, they have to go through a centralized source. And since, iOS and everything on an iPhone goes through Apple, push notifications are also processed through Apple. So the government was siphoning metadata and in some cases the contents of push notifications directed towards iPhone users. And it's interesting, since then, Apple's come out and said, yeah, we're not going to do that without a warrant or subpoena anymore. But it's now that it's out in the open, so they clearly took a hit, in their reputation.
Which is the incentive you want, right? You want the incentive for people to be like, hey, man, you told me this was secure and it's not, and so that there's some accountability.
Yeah.
But that's accountability after the fact rather than like built-in accountability like open source.
Right.
That would be the distinction, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And trust may be important to a certain number of people, but like you said, you're sacrificing convenience for every step you take towards security. So, for someone who maybe says, oh, I didn't know that about Apple, I'm committed to my own privacy and security, and I want to transition towards something like, Graphene OS, like there's kind of a long pathway there, right? Like, what are you giving up by going to that Android point from something like the Apple ecosystem where everything works perfectly together?
Right. Apple does a lot to make it painful to leave Apple products, which is something that, they do. And it's something that philosophically I have a problem with. I slowly, as I changed one of my devices out from Apple to something not Apple and just realized the degradation, right? And just everything else. Probably the best example I can give you is something as simple as a USB-C to like headphone jack adapter.
Yeah.
That was the last thing I had that was Apple. And I eventually had to throw it away because it was putting out half the volume of a normal one.
Really?
Yeah.
On an Android device?
On an Android device. Yeah. So I'm like, why this is all the volume I get? And I look it up on the internet and it's the Apple ones.
Really?
They only put out half the volume. Maybe it's just Pixel phone. That's what I tried it on.
But you think that like it's possible that Apple like engineered it to not work as well on an Android?
It makes me wonder. Something as simple as a USB-C to that piece of hardware, that $10 thing. So yeah, if you're looking at, okay, I'm all invested in Apple stuff, now I'm going to move out, that can be a painful process depending on how invested you are in. And that's by design. Absolutely. The whole green versus blue bubble thing,
Yep.
Yep. I got all my friends on Signal, which everybody gets blue bubbles on Signal, which is awesome.
Yeah. That's probably another rabbit hole to dive down is messaging and encryption and communications. I mean, how secure is an SMS message versus an iMessage versus Signal?
Yeah. Before we go there, I want to say one more thing about Android though.
Sure.
And that's like, there's some Linux phones out there that are really compromised, like in terms of the apps that you can run. Like you're not going to get Uber to run on a Linux phone. Android is on par with Apple in terms of app compatibility, in terms of just usability. Once you're past the Apple, just moving out of the Apple ecosystem. And what's cool about Graphene OS is that you get the benefit of Uber or Airbnb or your banking apps because of the way it's built. It has compartmentalization built into it. So you could have a user profile that's completely de-Googled and there's no connection to anything in there. You have only free open source software in that profile. Then you create another profile on the same phone. It's like carrying two phones in one, right? And on that second profile, you could have all of your Gmail work stuff. And I use Google products for work because I have to, because that's what everybody uses.
Yeah.
Right. So it's really, really awesome to have them segmented and segregated so that when I need it, it's there. But when I shut it down, I can trust that there's this clean separation between them, and they're not going to, it's not going to, the Google stuff isn't going to invade. That's how I think of it in my mind, because it really is that deep in standard Android. So what the Graphene OS guys have done is amazing in giving you like 99% of the convenience of having a smartphone, but you can set it up in a very secure way and then switch back and forth.
I like that. And actually that brings up another point that I remember from your presentation that I sat in on. There's a major difference between accessing something via a native app and accessing something via a browser, for example, Facebook or whatever.
Yeah.
If I go to Facebook via, say, Brave, and Brave has built-in protections for privacy and stuff like that, Facebook is sort of curtailed to the permissions that Brave allows it.
Right.
But when I install the Facebook app, right, and I click I agree to all the user permissions and that sort of the end user license agreement, everyone recall the South Park episode, the human Sentai pad, right? Have that mental image.
Yeah.
And I allow that to harvest all the data that I allow it to have, and I allow it access to my microphone and my camera and all those things. It has like broad permissions to grab so much stuff. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's better to access some of those kind of apps from a browser. Is that correct?
Yes. From a privacy standpoint, it is, because mobile apps in general, they can request permissions, or they can get permissions to the very core of your phone. And that's something that with some apps, you can tell it, no, you can't have that permission. No, you can't have that permission. Yes, you can have that permission. And the app will play nice and accept it. But some apps, they just won't work. They won't work if you do, because their whole business model is based on okay, it's free, but we're going to suck up your data. If you're not paying, you are the product kind of thing.
For sure.
A website, however, it's a website. So like you said, it's constrained to the browser. And there's a lot we can talk about having privacy and security within the browser, because a browser is almost like a computer in and of itself with how many apps can run. Probably the coolest one was someone wrote Windows 95 that runs in a browser.
Really?
Yeah. But it's a sandbox, and it can't get out into other parts of your phone. So that's something that I recommend is, if at all possible, if you need Facebook, consider having using Facebook in the browser instead of using the app. And that buys you a fair amount of privacy right there.
Yeah.
Interestingly, when Instagram released Threads, there's no website for it. You have to download the app.
Wild.
So in some cases, it's not an option.
People use Threads?
Hold on, I got
that
one.
did totally drop off.
Yep. Had to use the Stream Deck at least once. I think it's really interesting though, because to use Facebook or something like it in a browser, it's so inconvenient. Because you have to, it'll log you out automatically. So you got to enter your password and everything. And I forget all my passwords all the time. So I have to have an autofill password.
You don't have a password manager?
I do.
Okay.
I just use Brave's native password manager.
Okay.
Sweet.
What about the third-party ones? Are those good or bad?
You mean password managers?
Yeah. Nord has one. There's LastPass. There's a whole bunch of other ones that can exist where to be your password manager with the master password. And
Yeah.
You get the convenience, but hopefully...
I completely recommend password managers. I think they're great because they allow you to generate really secure passwords without having to memorize them. Mm-hmm. And then you can have one secure master password and focus on that. But I would say pick a really good password. Make sure you trust it, because you're literally trusting that thing with the keys of the kingdom. I really like Bitwarden because Bitwarden is open source, and their sync stuff works really well. And I just like open source stuff in general. That's kind of where I've gotten to. I've heard good things about 1Password. LastPass, they've had some issues.
Yeah.
I am not too familiar with it, with the technical details, but I just remembered
they got hacked.
Yeah, they got hacked. Something like that happened.
So it wasn't clear what exactly got released from my memory of it, but I know a lot of people freaked out when it happened.
Yeah. It made me change my master password, which is a big deal, because I recommend people, when you come up with a password, come up with a sentence.
Yeah.
Because it's long. Pick up a 5-word sentence.
Yeah.
That's a lot of letters. It's 25, 30 letters, but you can remember it.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like a seed phrase, but easier to remember.
Yes, exactly. Just like a seed phrase.
Yeah. For the crypto nerds out there.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe put some letters and numbers and exclamation points in there or something.
Yeah, exactly.